and welcome to an online interview with Douglas Wolk. I'm here with the author of this beautiful book, All the Marvels. It came out from Profile Books just a few months ago. Allow me just to introduce very briefly what the book is about. So in this book, Douglas, you proposed to read basically the entire production of comic books ever issued under the banner of Marvel. And as it's stated, this means 27,000 individual comic books or floppies. You do provide a more precise context, so you explain what you left out, what you've included, even though it went beyond the rules that you set yourself to, and how. But as I understand, basically, the main tenet of the book is how all of these parts construct a more or less connected story world, universe, comprised of many moving parts and stories and myriads of characters and different authors and editorial circumstances of production and so on. You call this, and I quote from page 13, a perpetually expanding canvas. And so the main thesis of the book is that all of these parts are connected in a way that they make one big story, right? So the first question that I would like to ask is, after reading 27,000, are you okay?
Amazingly, that is the first question everybody's asking me. Like,
I know.
Yeah, did you turn into Flaming Carrot? Like, are you going to be all right? It was rough. It's 2022. Nobody's okay. It was hard.
No. Go ahead. I don't want to.
No, that's really.
Okay, but taking kidding aside, the thing is, I can imagine that. As many of us that are both academic, or at least people that like to read comics for a very particular intellectual reason beyond fun. But also that is a very, very important thing, and you underline that throughout the book. It's very important, but there's also this secondary need of reading things in a mostly in a systematic way, contextualizing it historically, socially, politically, etc. But all of us have probably read, if we like Marvel Universe, we try to read piecemeal and then we go back, of course, because it depends on the age that we have. I started reading it back in the 70s, and I was reading Brazilian edition, so that meant something like 10-year distance from the original publication. I'm not sure, and then only later I would go back. So it's a very complicated puzzle. But this was a very specific reading practice that you dedicated yourself to. Do you want to explain a little bit how you prepared yourself physically, and how difficult it was, and how it went beyond that more normal practice of just discovering things as they were, or back issues and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I had a spreadsheet. There's a site called Mike's Amazing World that has a spreadsheet with everything Marvel's published on it, and that made it really useful to figure out like what I had to read, and I would highlight lines from it once I was done. And I didn't read everything in order. If I had read everything in order, I would have lost my mind. I grazed. I read what I felt like on any given day. And if I was getting bored with something, then I could jump to something else. Or if there was an artist I liked, I would just read everything that artist had done. Or if there was a character I wanted to follow, I would follow them. So it wasn't like, okay, today it's more 1992. It was whatever I felt like. That said, once I got to a certain point near the end, I realized that there were some pockets of the reading that I had been neglecting or avoiding or putting off, which is how I ended up locking myself into an apartment for 11 days with 30 years of The Punisher.
Yeah.
That just forcing myself to read all The Punisher. Just okay, I'm going to take my medicine now.
Okay, so actually, one of the things, the organization of your book, I think it's extremely productive. So you do not, as you said, you do not follow a straightforward chronological order. And then again, which chronological? Because it could be the chronology of its production or the chronology of the storyline, which would be even more complicated perhaps. But you organize this through thematic threads, or at least chapters that, sometimes they're bigger, sometimes they're small, they're dedicated to a character or a storyline. And as you say yourself, it's like you're trying to dedicate each chapter to a node that creates like a meaningful facet of a multifaceted jewel. So you try to see it through that facet, how it illuminates the whole thing. And moreover, you quote from Kieran Gillen's Stories by Loki, which is our patron saint for the night, although he's suffering at the ends of doom here, when he states that gods, and I term as superhero characters from comics, that they don't have histories but stories, which actually in Portuguese it would be tricky because it's the same, we use the same word.
Right.
But I'm reminded also of your, at least the previous book that I read, Reading Comics, which is still a wonderful book. And were you reading these things and taking notes and writing chapters, or did you have the organization of the book? What was the relationship between the reading part and the writing part?
So it was kind of tricky. I wrote a book proposal initially that had like, okay, these are some things that I'm going to have chapters on. That ended up bearing very little relationship to the final book. I ended up actually writing the book twice. I wrote it the first time and it was terrible. And I talked with my editor about it, and he was like, yeah, you just have to go back and reconceive the entire thing. Have to totally start over. And so I threw out like 85% of what was there and started fresh. And I kept writing more than I was going to use. And if I thought something like might be an interesting path to go down, I would write that. And most of the time I'd be like, yeah, no, just no. So I threw out a lot of stuff. What I ended up doing when I had realized I had like much more than I was going to need was thinking about what is going to make this the most readable book? What is going to make it the best experience for a person reading it? And there were some chapters that I was pretty happy with. It was like, then they have to go. They will drag down the thing. They will make it less fun as a whole. Even as much as I like them, I'll use that stuff someplace else someday. Fine.
Yeah, because one thing, it's interesting because you do not, I don't think that you are pandering at all to the expectations of a broader readership towards Marvel. You're doing your own reading because, for instance, you quote and pick up things that I didn't know even existed. I'm not saying that I'm a Marvel connoisseur of everything, of course, but I'm pretty knowledgeable to a certain point. But there was things that are very obscure. So and I don't think that you're following. So part of this was, I guess, a project of passion, right? Of a more fan-based point of departure, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah. There's the question of like, am I going to do a representative thing, and what is representative anyway? Am I going to do like, an accurate quotes historical guide to this stuff, or is it just going to be like, no, let me be a tour guide. Let me show the things that I think my readers might find interesting and that I find kind of interesting, and just these are some pathways that people might want to go down. It is not quite the classical canon of like these are the 100 great stories. Like,
Sure.
it overlaps with that some. Canons reinforce themselves. Like if you see like the 10 greatest stories ever named, then you keep seeing those same 10 every time it comes up. And
Yeah.
that bothers me. It seems kind of anti-progressive to think like, oh, we have these masterpieces and we can never have a masterpiece like them again. Like when Sight and Sound or whatever or Cahiers du Cinema like lists the 10 best movies ever. It's always the same 10 movies. Like,
Yeah.
what have we not made any movies since 1950? So I wanted it to be like, okay, these are the things that I care about and I think are interesting, and that I might be able to persuade people are interesting too. And that means leaving stuff out. There, as a number of people said, there is no Daredevil section. Yeah, there's no Daredevil section. It would have been kind of redundant, and it wouldn't have had a coherent argument. There is no Hulk section. There is a big old Captain America chapter that got cut. There's a big old Iron Man chapter that got cut. I wanted it to not be the perfect book, but a book that could be read with pleasure for what it is, and that meant leaving stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, if it had the Captain America, the Hulk, it would just say the same thing all over again, underlining the centrality of those characters. But for instance, I love the chapter on Linda Carter because it refocuses the whole thing. I mean, it's very bold, the thing that you say. I'm not sure if I don't go into forums, so I don't know if other people have proposed that. But I'm not saying what it is, so people will read and be surprised because there is, in a certain way, I said that the chapters are separate and automatic, but there is a thread that creates a whole narrative. And anyway, your point is exactly that there is a unified narrative. So to go away just a little bit away from Marvel, you do not attempt a direct comparison or study. That's not the point of the book, of course, but there are always other counter examples of this sort of connected narratives. I mean, DC would be the first thing to go to, but we could also talk about other North American superhero producers like Dark Horse or Valiant, or even talk about Alan Moore's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is also a rehashing of Philip Farmer's world
Yeah.
etc. And man, we could go back to Greek mythology, where you have myths where you have cameos from one god or a demigod in an adventure of another guy, and they cross over. You have the Justice League with the Argonauts and all that kind of thing. But so I would ask, what is particularly different? What is it so special about this Marvel unity, either for you personally or in a broader sense for narrative making?
Yeah, that's a super good question. What's special about Marvel is that, unlike really any other story of its kind, it's been going on continuously since, let's say, 1961. You can say earlier if you want, but like beyond 61, like it is always very deliberately one big story. And that is not quite true of the DC story, because it's rebooted at least twice, and actually, kind of 3 times and kind of sort of 4 times.
And they throw away the continuity in a certain way,
and they
right?
throw away the past, or they say like, oh, that happened, but that's a whole other universe. We're not going to talk about that right now.
Yeah.
And that means that it doesn't have that huge force of history behind it. And the other thing about Marvel is there's a lot of it. There are certain soap operas that have been going on that long or longer. In the U.S., there's General Hospital. There's Search for Tomorrow, which I don't think exists anymore. They've been going on since the time of radio. But the difference there is that the old parts of the story are gone. Like there is not a physical record of them. In some cases, like you can maybe buy an old DVD, but there's not the sense of like the active library like there is with comics. And I've said if I had to pick one giant, decades-long, many-creator comics narrative that was my favorite, it'd probably be Judge Dredd, uh, the British Judge Dredd series. But there's actually what I think is going to be an incredibly good Judge Dredd book being written by Michael Moultrie right now. But Marvel was the mountain. It was Mount Everest. It was K2. It was the thing that I had to. Okay, that's gonna be the big one.
Well, actually, I think that it is very powerful, that metaphor that you did. If I can rehash it for the viewers, if they haven't read the book, you use this metaphor of the whole text as a huge mountain that has very beaten paths and other tracks and caves, and so each individual reader will deal with the mountain in various different aspects. Some will go straight to the top, whatever the top is. Other people will go around it. Other will explore caves. It's beautiful, that metaphor, because it is true. I imagine that it's very difficult for any two readers, even if they're from the same generation, appearing at the same time, to read everything or the bulk of it in the same manner, because there will be different jump points and going back, etc., and navigating that kind of thing. So it's very beautiful. It's really adroit, the way that he created that metaphor. But however, I would like to ask something, because there is this coordination of the past. So as we read it throughout the years, and as many texts, it's like a puzzle. We're never sure of how the puzzle is completely connected, but we have this idea, and even if the parts don't fit, we know that they will fit in some way. So, but I was wondering, where do you think that this wonderful coordination comes from? Does it stem from, even if belatedly, from editorial effort, or even corporate control, because these are, after all, trademarks that are very important to survive in order to do, especially with the cinematic production, then merchandising, which you do not discuss, but it's very important to preserve these? Or do you think that it has to do with the authors? Even sometimes the authors will work to another company, but in Marvel, they feel the necessity or the freedom or the possibilities of connecting and rewriting, retconning, and that kind of thing? Or is there something intrinsic to the characters or the storylines? Where do you think that this comes from? This is a little mystic, but
well, where it comes from, it comes from Jack Kirby, it comes from Stan Lee, it comes from the very, very few people who were doing work for Marvel in the 1960s. The number of people who were writing and drawing for them, even by the mid 60s, you can pretty much count them on the fingers of both hands. And where it all comes together, I've got that little chapter about that month in 1965 where suddenly there are events from one series that are paying off in others. And those, it centers on 4 comics that were drawn by Jack Kirby and published in the space of a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. And between him and Lee, there's this kind of coordination of okay, we can have this thing connect to that thing, and that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And it's not the first time that had ever been done. And arguably the first time Marvel did it was right near the beginning of the story, and it was with Linda Carter and Millie the Model and Patsy and Hebe and all that. But
true, we would say probably Namor and Human Torch, right?
Exactly, yeah.
This happened before that, right?
Well, they met up, but what's different about the one with Linda Carter and Patsy and Hebe is that there are events from one comic that are paying off in another comic.
Yeah.
That it's all clearly one world. And that's something that you can do when you have just a few creators because it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who were reading it thought it was really fun too. And being able to maintain the idea that like it's all really one world, and like none of these stories are isolated from the others, that you can see them pay off in each other's comics, like that's a special effect. That's a cool thing, and it's a thing that people kept trying to reproduce, and eventually like it became a selling point. It became a thing that people making these comics A had to do or B got to do. It might be an obligation, it might be a pleasure, but either way, it's happening. and
Yeah.
uh, and it is a pleasure for readers when it's done well. It's something that this particular medium can do, this particular genre of this particular medium can do, that pretty much doesn't happen anywhere else, and that's a strength.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, and I'm actually I haven't not read it yet. I have yet another book to read with Daniel Stein's
Oh,
authorizing
huh.
superheroes. So I guess that this idea of the auteur, even in its French sense, within the superheroes, it's very interesting to discuss. I mean, because this idea of the retconning, for instance,
Mhm.
it's something that existed in literature. You have the Quixote, where Cervantes, when he wrote the second part, he was reappropriate because people did fake versions of Quixote. So said, no, 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 this is my Quixote. So the second part corrects that. You have, of course, the classical example of Sherlock Holmes, where the character dies and then he has to begrudgingly a little bit, but yeah, he has to make Sherlock Holmes come back to life in a way. So even this idea of death, it's not the end, even in characters. I mean, we could do comparisons from other parts of creativity from other art forms. But here, I mean, it's very special, as you say, because it's like first you make people believe that you're following different places, and then suddenly they reveal that they are connected. And I think that it's this revealing of paths in the back streets that connect everything, and then it suddenly expands very quickly. It's really a strange pleasure. um, I'm sorry, this is not a
No,
question.
absolutely. No, you're that's fantastic. That's absolutely right.
But there's a beautiful thing that you also say in another part when you're correcting Chris Claremont when he says that he considers his original X-Men run as a novel, and you say, if I can read, sorry, you say it is Chris Claremont X-Men run. It's a distinct body of work, but it's an improvisation more than a composition. So improvisation is the key word here in the manner through which this universe has been constructed, right? I mean, it's things that appear, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a collective improvisation. It
Hmm.
is, we keep thinking about authorship and creatorship, and especially in superhero comics, it just doesn't work that way. There is collaboration going on between artists and writers and editors and readers, and people are feeding ideas to each other and seizing on them and working with them. And there's collaboration between creators who are in the same room, and there's collaboration between creators who are separated by continents and decades, uh, looking at each other's work and going, oh, let me play with that. Let me build something on that. That's really special. Uh, it means that we cannot attribute things to one person a lot of the time, but I think it's useful to not attribute things to one person a lot of the time. I was talking with somebody a few days ago about the Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, like all the Cosmic Marvel stuff they did with Annihilation and Guardians of the Galaxy. And Abnett and Lanning worked together as a writing team for a long time, for more than 20 years, before like things broke down and they split. And one of the things that Abnett said afterwards is people always assumed that it was an equal collaboration, and that really grated on me because Andy and I would chat about things, and he would give me ideas, but I was really the person who did the great bulk of the writing, and it was not an equal collaboration. And my response to that was like, who says collaborations have to be equal? Like,
It's a little
as
bit like discussion of Stan Lee and Kirby, right? You have the
yeah,
people saying Stan Lee robbed everything
yeah,
and Kirby invented the loan. But I mean, I was not there, but I believe it was truly a collaboration. People, I don't know if you've watched this beautiful documentary on the Beatles. And the thing is,
yeah,
one of the things that I loved about it, and I'm not a particular Beatles fan, but it was to watch the creative thing. And the thing is, you can say, okay, Paul McCartney is improvising and doing this, but yeah, but without the other guys in front of him responding, however they would respond, things would not be developed as they were. I mean,
yeah,
you can find the song, but it's really a true form of collaboration, and it's beautiful to watch that kind of collaboration. That's the word. It's not equal. Yeah, I agree with
yeah,
you.
yeah. I mean, I have relatively little experience with making comics, but I got to do a mini series with the artist Ulysses Farinas about 6 years ago, and that was an absolute joy. And like to get into it and realize how collaborative it was, that I could write something that would be specifically for him to draw, or he would send me a sketch of a character and say like, okay, I just drew this guy. I don't know who this guy is, but can you put him in the story? And I would go, oh, I know who that guy is, and now I know how that issue is going to work.
Yeah.
That's magical.
If I can talk a little bit of my experience, because I do write
Yeah,
comics and I
yeah,
do have collaborations, and I do, for instance, every month I do a 2-page comic, always with the different artists, and it's never the same. It doesn't, it's people of all ages and with different styles, etc., and it's always new, and I'm always learning something different. So it's really strange to expect that people give 50% or 50%. It's
yeah,
that doesn't work that way. Actually, one thing, because of that improvisation and people put things different. Don't I know that the book is only with books until 2017. I don't know if you've read a more recent series, for instance, Mark Waid's The History of the Marvel Universe,
yeah,
or those series Life Stories with
yeah,
Spider-Man and Fantastic
yeah,
Four. Every time there's these series that try, I mean, Life Stories is a little different. It's not continued, not canon, but still, when they try to organize stories that try to tell the whole thing in an organized story, it doesn't work.
yeah.
It's really strange, don't you think?
Yeah, I actually I like Fantastic Four Life Story especially a whole lot. Like
Hmm.
what Mark Russell has been doing with that, it's really really clever, and it is turning this big improvised structure into something that's like, but what if we had been thinking of it as a single thing from the beginning? Similarly with X-Men Grand Design, the Ed
Yeah,
Piskor project,
yeah.
which like it's strange because it reads like a plot summary. It doesn't read like a story.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I mean, not that the
yeah,
story is bad,
no,
not at all, or the art.
yeah,
I mean, the history of Marvel Universe,
yeah,
the art is by Javier Rodriguez. It's
it's
beautiful,
incredible. Yeah, he's yeah,
but it's just that it doesn't flow the same way, and the pleasure is not the same, because it's like us watching someone put a puzzle together and go like, wait a minute, that part is not there. You want
right,
to you want to intervene,
yeah,
and you can't do anything. I don't know. It's just strange. To go back to that pleasure of having all these parts floating so you can connect them in different
mhm,
ways sometimes. And when we see these kind of things that try to, okay, this is the puzzle, it's just that's I don't
yeah.
know. But maybe it's my opinion, okay?
No, I'm trying to think if there's an example of something that is trying to be both a story and a like this is a summary of everything. We're going to put everything in, and yeah, I think it's really hard that you're serving two masters that way. It's really
Yeah.
hard to do that way.
Yeah. I mean, you also see that the it also happens in another way, which is when you have uh, I mean, the cinematic universe, for instance, it is much more centralized, right? In the sense of being composed and not improvised. I mean, and you also have those summits. I think it's DC that they have the architects, right? Where you have I guess Marvel is the same thing. They have meetings and they make these plans to, okay, this has to happen, etc. But the more you try to control, the less lively the stories seem to be. No, would you agree? I'm
Yeah,
not being.
I think one big exception to that has been the XMen Office over the last 2 years, like the Jonathan Hickman period. I don't know if you've been reading any of that, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like I just listened to the interview with Hickman that was on Jay and Miles yesterday,
No, I didn't.
and that was super interesting. Like the X-Men office was very, very tight. They all had I think a Discord or something, and they were or a Slack, and they were all constantly like in communication with each other. And there was so much synergy that came out of that because they had the rough roadmap, but the understanding is like if we want to go off this, we go off this. And if you have an idea for somebody else's book, tell them, and maybe they'll use it. And they kept using them. Like, and that is what has made so much of that part of the line so special over the last couple of years. Just everybody is open to other people's creative contributions, and that's interesting to think about. I think.
Yeah, but Hickman is a writer that I mean, he's capable of thinking. Okay, in 30 centuries, this is what's going to happen
Right.
to Captain America, right? I mean, it seems that he's more plot oriented and really sprawling cosmic sagas than to focus on. I mean, it's a different style. We read, I guess, different authors for different reasons, and sometimes we follow a character despite the author. Sometimes that happens, and there's always this possession, I guess. It's typical. It's funny because I remember talking to a leading comic scholar that does not read superhero comics, so it's working in a completely different area. And we were discussing it because I read a little bit of everything, and this person was asking what is so special about it, and it's really a culture. It's really, I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Asterix and Obelix, but you
Oh
have
yeah.
this recurring,
Oh yes.
yeah, the recurrent joke of Obelix is strong because he fell down the pot with a potion. So I think it's that kind of thing. When we were kids, at least that's my case, I fell into the pot of superheroes. So it's really, it doesn't matter, no matter how much I try to educate myself out of this popular culture, it's impossible. It's really ingrained. So every time it appears, there's a sheer pleasure of watching these characters. And I think that your book refreshed for me many of the or it made clear for me many of the pleasures that comes out from reading all of these little pieces. One of the things that I liked very much, I know that you didn't have much time, is that you mentioned the letters column and the ads even, which points out to an aspect of both materiality and historical context that sometimes it's forgotten when we read these stories as trade paperbacks or
Yes.
separate texts, especially at the age of the graphic novel today. Do you think this is a loaded question and perhaps a badly bad question, but do you think that this new this change of the commercial driven format of the graphic novel, it's easier to sell in some aspects, or the cultural legitimacy seeking aspect of this moniker, do you think that has changed and in another manner erased or hidden parts of comics more popular and participative origins, you think?
Huh.
You mentioned participation of the readers.
Yeah.
And that's very important. Sometimes the readers became authors later on, right?
very
But
much so.
do you think that that has changed a little bit today?
It has and it hasn't. I mean, there's obviously you don't see letter columns as often. You see, as you say, collected editions or digital versions of things are not the same as the physical object, especially for older ones.
Hmm.
Or there are, I don't know if you've seen any of the new quote Infinity comics that are created specifically to be read on a phone.
I have.
And then those are going to be reprinted as physical comics, which is strange. And that's going to be another kind of like, well, why is everything vertical? But the participatory aspect is still very much there. It's just changed venues. There was not Reddit in the 1960s. There was not Twitter in the 1960s. There are all of these places where people can talk about these things with each other in a way that it really, really could not in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So it's moved, it's changed. And sometimes that discourse happens. One thing that's really special about the discourse in the 60s and 70s is that it is happening in the pages of the comics themselves. Like there are strongly, strongly critical letters that are being printed in the comic. And that's amazing. And I talk about it, especially in the context of Master of Kung Fu, like you see it gradually changing what you're seeing in the editorial material and the stories. That discourse does not happen within the comics themselves so more, but it is happening and it does have an effect. It's just where that discourse is happening. It keeps changing all the time.
It's fun. I'm sorry for talking about another book while this interview, but I was checking one of the chapters from Daniel Stein's book is negotiating paratext, author bios, letter pages, fanzines. I know that letters still continue today in the comics, but it is true that I have not read everything, but it seems that they are less critical and more, oh, I love this comic, it's beautiful, my daughter read it, etc. So there's not much participation in that sense of critical, because that critical part passed on to YouTube commentaries, Reddit forums, and that kind of thing, which sometimes reach, very passionate degrees, I guess. But the thing is, it seems, I don't have data with me, but it seems that there was this expectation that, for instance, the cinematic adaptations or the TV adaptations would bring more readership, but it seems that that is not happening. So it's not changing that much the readers, or at least from sources that I read. I'm not sure if this is true.
So my best friend here runs a comic book store, and what she's told me is that the people who see a Spider-Man movie in the theaters or see Endgame in the theaters, they're not going to come in and start buying the comics monthly, but they are going to come in and buy the trades.
Okay.
And there are books that just sell and sell and sell and sell and sell. And it is a very, very different kind of audience. I guess about 15 years ago, I got to see Paul Levitt's talk back when he was the publisher of DC. And DC had just done a huge readership demographic survey. And they've never released the results of it officially. And he said, well, it's proprietary, but I'm going to tell you this. We discovered that there are two main types of readers reading our stuff. One of them are the weekly readers. They're the people who come into the store every Wednesday. They buy about $20 worth of stuff. They're mostly guys of a certain age. I know a lot of them by name. They're great. But that is their habit. Every Wednesday, $20 worth of stuff. The other big demographic group is people who come in maybe 3 times a year, and they will not buy individual issues. They will buy books, and they will buy a couple $100 worth of books at once. And they are devoted, passionate readers, much more likely to be women, much more likely to be somewhat younger. And these are the things that they are buying. And we publish stuff and they buy it. And they are not involved in the sort of week-to-week arguments and conversations and discussions in the same way, but they are devoted and passionate, and they spend the money on this stuff. And it is really foolish to write them off ever, because business reasons, they're a big source of income. They are a big source of mind share and of about caring about what we do. And that was really illuminating for me, that the buying habit, among other things, like the way that these stories are consumed, could be a couple of completely different channels for completely different audiences getting the same story.
Of course, we both know that we are talking mainly about superhero mainstream North American stories, right? Because if we talked about Japanese comics and different genres of Japanese comics, European independent, it would be a whole different game. We're talking about superheroes. And I think that DC is very attentive to that, because they've been putting out a lot of young adult standalone graphic novels with their superheroes, Teen Titans and that kind of thing, with each character. And usually they're more dramatic, romantic driven storylines with these characters. So I see that there's a tension towards that. Or the Tamaki, not cousins, I'm sorry, it's only Mariko Tamaki, I can't remember the name of the author. They did that Breaking Glass with Harley Quinn. That was very successful, I think, in terms of sales. But I guess that it's really a different demographic and a different imagination, let's say. So it's less bogged down by continuity than about caring about that character in the certain situation. I think maybe there's a difference of the reading, don't you think?
Maybe. Sure. I don't really know.
No, but I mean, I also think that diversity is very important. Actually, I had other questions before. Maybe we will go back to them, but I enjoyed all the chapters, but there are some chapters that are a little bit more emotive in a way. So when you discuss, for instance, I can't remember the title of the chapter, but when you discuss Miss Marvel and the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, I'm sorry, I can't remember. Good is the thing you do. That's the title of the chapter. It seems to me that you're pointing out to a certain change of the ways that the stories are told. Not a question only of the diversity of the characters, we will go back to that, but really the style of the stories, because it's less about conflict than about another kind of problem solving by these characters, right? Do you think that there is a change? On the one hand, I know that you said that there's a lot of things that it's going back to the roots of Marvel in the 60s, the young teenager in high school trying to solve life, of course, with parents and all that. But at the same time, it's also informed by a different culture. And I guess there are some changes, right? Do you think that those changes are visible?
Maybe. You're still seeing like a lot of crazy visual set pieces. Like, Ms. Marvel stories and Squirrel Girl stories are there exist prose stories about those characters, as there exist others, but their comics are comics. Like they are meant to be looked at. There is spectacle, there is conflict, there is all that stuff that you associate with superhero comics. I think it may be that the emotive stuff that you're talking about is missing from some superhero comics. I think finding that kind of balance is part of what makes things that kind of stick in the memory. I don't know.
Well, there are changes that are you discussed that the way that things follow throughout history, they try to it's a response to the time where they are being produced. Actually, I don't want to go into that much detail because it's more like a pet project. I'm not at the moment a working scholar, but I do have an academic project that I would love to pursue that has to do with the notion of the archival nature of comics and the way that comics make stories based on the archive of its own history.
Right.
Captain America is particularly a character that responds to history and present tensions in a way. You mentioned that in the introduction as well, of course. But one of the funny things is that sometimes we see in some forums discussion, oh, comics are too political now, but they've always been political. I mean, the cover of the first Captain America, he's punching the face of the leader. I'm sorry to say, a democratically elected leader of a country with which America was not at war at the moment, right? So in a certain way, he was going beyond what the government was preparing. I'm talking about Hitler, of course, and Captain America. But so they have always been political. But it seems that today things, especially in certain areas of discussion, they seem a little bit more passionate, or especially when it's related to identity. You know, when people use that kind of argument, say, oh, why don't they invent new characters and they're rehashing the same with a different identity? But it has always been like that, but in less fast ways, probably. But this political aspect is very important as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, because as you say, the creators are always responding to what is around them in the culture. They are making stories about the things that they care about that are happening at their historical moment. And that is one of the big things that is on people's minds right now, identity in all its forms. And that means it's a springboard for stories. Uh, and yes, absolutely, superhero comics have always been political. They have been various kinds of political, but I can't think of, it's real hard to do a story that responds to its historical moment and is not political, right? Like that is the definition of what it is.
Well,
So
usually when
that's
people say that it's not political, it means that it's so conformed to the
right,
homogeneity of the moment, and
right,
people are in that homogeneity, so they don't see it, right? They're within,
right. You
like
wait
that.
10 or 20 years, it's going to look real political.
Yeah, probably. Okay, I have a question that it's a very personal question, so I hope that
Yeah.
it's not because I don't know how to pose this question. So please, if it's not, I can cut it from the discussion. But there's a footnote on page 31 when you mention the discussion boards at the Marvel Chronology Project, and you say that they are, I quote, Talmudically precise efforts, end quote, in reading the comics.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if, because many of the authors were indeed Jewish. I don't know if this is important or not, but this idea of the Talmudic reading, if I can say Jewish influence or Jewish practices of reading, which is to connect all the dots of the words, the phrasing, gematria, and all the kind of things. Do you think that this kind of reading because this is the part of the readers, not of the authors, but do you think that this has influenced a very specific way of reading these texts in particular, or is this something that could be applied to anything? Or
Yeah, I think it is. I don't think it is specific to these comics. I think you can see the same kind of attention paid to Star Wars. You can see like any kind of mass entertainment is going to get that kind of like very, very close reading. Um, I don't think it's specific to this. It's just when it happens to the thing that I particularly like, then yeah, I'll join in with that.
But I think that
Yeah.
the reading then passes on to the texts as well, right? I mean,
Yeah.
for instance, you have all these videos about the Easter eggs. No one can do anything within a Marvel series. If they there's a hotel scene and they go to a room and the room has a number on the door, and then it's, oh, that's the number of something and that T-shirt. So it's all these connections. It becomes active part of the text again. So it's always, so I think it's more powerful probably in this kind of text than anywhere else. But I don't know. I would have to do a comparison.
Okay, fair enough. Like I don't have a better argument about that.
I may be wrong, of course. There's also another quote that I enjoyed very much, where it said there's, and it dives right into what I was just trying to discuss. You say, I quote, "There's hidden knowledge to be found in them for those who take the time to look deeply." Again, the interpretation. And you go, in fact, to, in many extents, to reveal and explore many of the red threads that connect one text to the other, sometimes in very subtle ways, sometimes probably even the authors or editors were not aware of that kind of connections later on. So it's again, they probably did not read the same comics, and they have not probably read everything, but it's very beautiful the way that you connect these things. So is Marvel the best? is that what you want to say? I would like to ask you about the more about the personal things. I mean, again, what took you to read the Marvel comics more than anything else?
I mean, the appeal of Marvel was the size of the story, but as I mentioned in the book, like the thing that got me thinking about it was reading them with my son. Reading with my kid when he was 10 years old. He was like, I want to read these stories with you, Dad. Like, okay. And bonding with him over that and seeing the pleasure that he was getting out of them and how like mine it was, and also how completely different from my own pleasure it was, that he was getting his own thing out of it. That got me interested, and that got me thinking about, like, okay, what is this big story? Because I am attracted to big stories. I really, really like enormous things. I was reading Samuel Richardson novels in college, and I loved the idea that it was a story that was so big that not even the people telling it had read the whole thing. That it was not a story that's so big that it was not supposed to be experienced in its entirety. Which, of course, I had the hubris to be like, all right, so I'm going to do it. I'm not the only person who's done it. I've discovered I know by name at least one other person who has read the entire corpus, and I know there's a couple others I think may have. But I liked that with my experience of talking about comics and explaining stuff to people who would want to know about it but might not want to experience it themselves, to put myself in a position where I could do that. And like, okay, so I read all of these so you don't have to. Like that.
And do you think that by having this knowledge and reading the text, you see that sometimes I don't know exactly how to explain this, but there's this idea of possession from us readers and fans of these kinds of texts, because you tend to enjoy a specific author or a storyline or a run, that kind of thing. And then when you have another person that enjoys something else, and it's not that good because this is the real definitive version. Do you think that you have passed that attitude, and that we have these characters, we have these stories, but they are very varied. They're not one thing. They can be looked at in a multitude of perspectives. So it's even more beautiful to understand that there's not one version of whatever thing we're considering at the moment. right?
Yeah, I love seeing how other people enjoy things. I love it when it is different from the way I enjoy it, especially if it is something that I like too, if somebody else likes it for completely different reasons. I love listening to cosplayers talk about what they do, why they latch onto a particular costume, what they do to reconstruct it, what is special about it to them. Like that is a completely different way from how I approach things. I am not a cosplay person. I do not have that gene. But seeing the way that people talk about it and seeing their passion for it and their understanding of what every detail of the way a person dresses can mean, um, that's extraordinary to me. I just love that.
Well, sometimes, I mean, of course, I don't have time to read everything, and sometimes there are things that I'm not curious about. And when I read someone talking passionately about something, a run or a character,
Mhm.
usually I'm influenced enough to go and read it. So your book has made me put a new pile of books to read, a
Oh,
new or look into things, because it's really amazing, marvelous the way that you write about this thing. So it makes me read it again. So Douglas, thank you very, very much for this talk. Congratulations on your book. I
thank you
hope
so
to read
much.
you again in the near future. I'm sure I will. And I hope to see you soon, uh,
Yeah, great.
sometime.
Thank you so much. This was a joy.
Thank you.
All right.
See you next time.
Take care.
Thank you,
All right.
everyone.
All right. Bye bye.